Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, and what a fantastic venue, what a fantastic presentation. I think Sid just gave us a little bit of a case study of what Florida 2030 could look like. My challenge in the next 15 minutes is to give you a little bit of an overview of the research. So you've got two documents in front of you at your table. There's a larger book. This is sort of Trends and Disruptors. It's the result of 2 years of research on what are the major drivers of change facing Florida as we look out to the year 2030. The second book, Targets and Strategies. So those are the 39 targets that Mark Wilson mentioned, strategies for helping us get there, organized around the 6 pillars. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the research and particularly the strategies and targets in the infrastructure area, but really to set up for the panels and speakers who are going to come. And the real theme we're going to talk about here is, how do we live and work and connect at the speed of opportunity in 2030 so that the types of opportunities we're seeing here at Babcock Ranch really become what we're experiencing statewide. I do want to thank, I know many of you who are here in this room were participants in the town hall meetings, were part of the Infrastructure Pillar Advisory Committee. I want to particularly thank Rob Palmer and the team from RSNH, who are our key research partner for this pillar. Just really it's been a tremendous effort of looking to the future and how do we set up for this time of change. So let me kind of highlight a couple of things. We looked at 8 major drivers of change that are going to shape Florida between now and the year 2030. And we talked a lot this morning about growth and about those 5 million new residents and 60 million or so new visitors a year and significant more jobs by the year 2030. But it's more than growth. It's about the tremendous change we're seeing in the very nature of how do we work, how does our economy get structured, how do we live, and what are some of the risks that we're facing. So global markets, we've seen this growth over the last couple of decades, but even more so as we look into the future. The global part of the economy is the fastest growing part, and the role of trade and tourism and global investment just continues to grow each year in Florida, around the world. By the year 2050, we'll be at a situation where East Asia is sort of larger economy than North America, where we've got a lot more opportunities to sell Florida goods and services worldwide. We also have a lot more competition. Some of the estimates suggest that by the year 2030, 45% of the Fortune 500 companies could be based in the global market. So how do we position for those opportunities? How do we position for that competition? And how do we think about all of the tremendous investments that we've seen in our transportation system, in our seaports and our airports over the past decade are really just the beginning, because we need to continue to invest to remain competitive and to really be leading the world in this area. We think about innovation, everything that we've just been hearing, and that accelerating pace of change, that the turnaround cycle of new products coming to market, reaching critical mass of market penetration gets faster and faster each year. And as we look ahead to things like the autonomous and connected vehicles, or like artificial intelligence, or like Internet of Things, it's going to transform the very nature of how every single business functions, and it's going to transform how we manage our infrastructure. And so transportation could look completely different in 2030. Energy could look very different. Water, a lot of the things that we are accustomed to today could be tremendously different by that period. And then the nature of our labor market changing as well. Over the past couple of decades nationwide, we've seen this trend where most of the job growth nationwide has been in sort of what we're referring to as sort of cognitive non-routine jobs. So those are our knowledge jobs that require high-end skills, well-trained workers, very specialized activities that are not easily repeatable, and then a lot of growth in sort of the manual non-routine service jobs as well. A lot of the things that are routine are becoming automated, and so there are many projections that 50% or more of today's jobs could become automated using existing technologies, and that 50, 60, 80% of the jobs by the year 2030 may be in occupations that don't even exist today. So how do we prepare our workforce for those jobs in the future? And what does that mean for our infrastructure that gets us there? So think about just the gig economy and the number of people who are not working in full-time jobs but are working on a contract basis, sometimes multiple jobs at once. sometimes on very flexible hours. Well, our entire transportation system has been set up around how do people commute to work for a standard job? What happens when people are working many different times of day, many different places, and where a location like this or a coffee shop may become the primary point of work for many people during their point of the day? How do we get the transportation and the connectivity to get that to work? We're talking about the growth of our population, but also the diversity. And so by the year 2030, 1 out of every 4 Floridians will be over the age of 65. The millennials are the largest part of our workforce today. We'll be seeing the growth of Gen Z as well, a very multi-generational workforce in Florida and around the country, many more demands for what types of infrastructure, what types of services people are looking for. Just one snapshot, just a survey that the Urban Land Institute did, asking people of different generations, where do you live today and where would you like to live in the future? And sort of an interesting takeaway, millennials definitely, as we hear about in the reports, are telling us, compared to other generations, they want to live in the large cities, they want to live in the urban environments. We're also seeing that, of course, among seniors, a greater interest in living in urban environments than in the past. But there's still a lot of people who are saying they want to live in suburbs, they want to live in rural areas, they want to live in small towns. And so the takeaway really from that is that it's not one size fits all, it's that people are looking for choices. They're looking for quality places where they can live and work and raise a family, and that we need to embrace all of them as we think about the future of Florida. We are going to become more urbanized as a state. Even today, 9 out of every 10 Floridians lives in an urbanized area. The expectation is our urban areas are going to become more and more integrated by the year 2030. Some projections show that by 2050, the Florida Peninsula will basically function as an integrated mega region, one of 10 to 12 nationwide that's really driving U.S. growth over that time frame. But one of the things I think is particularly unique about Florida is the opportunities for the rural and inland areas. In many parts of the country, the rural areas are truly rural, they're isolated. In Florida, there's no part of the state that's that's more than 2 hours from an urban center or from the coast. And so tremendous opportunities to think about how do we create a small town, a rural lifestyle for people in Florida, but still have access to urban areas, to amenities around the state. 2 more risks I just want to touch very quickly on. So the risk of resources, and this of course is nothing new, but we look at our federal debt as a percentage of our economy reaching highs we haven't seen since World War II. We look at many state and local governments that are facing more and more constrained resources. We look at our private household debt at record highs across the country. There are a lot of constraints facing resources and a lot of balancing that against, of course, the tremendous investment need that we need in our infrastructure, whether it's transportation or water or energy, to support those additional 5 million residents. So thinking very carefully about how do we invest, how do we have the resources for our future infrastructure, and particularly where in many sectors our infrastructure is based on old funding models. So for example, all the advancements we're seeing with autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and so forth are fantastic, but balance that against the fact that our primary source of revenue for transportation is the motor fuel tax. So as that declines in value, how are we finding the investment for transportation in the future? Then there's sort of the risk of just sort of the increasing risks we're facing from an environmental, a climate, a weather, another perspective around the world. This is just sort of a chart looking at the number of declared U.S. disasters per year over the past couple of decades. It is definitely going up. I think part of that is our government agencies more quickly designate disasters to get aid to people, but there's certainly that trend of as we heard, the 500-year storms happening more often, the hurricanes happening more often, and it's not just, of course, the weather, extreme weather, but also thinking about as we become a more global economy, the risks related to things like invasive species and infectious diseases grow each year as well. So how do we be prepared for those risks, and how do we have a resilient strategy that we can accommodate and continue to sustain our quality of life in the face of increasing number of risks? As part of this effort, there was 83 town halls held around the state. I think many of you were participated in them, really asking people, what do you see as the challenges facing Florida? And just kind of a quick snapshot here, but we asked people, do you see different aspects of Florida's competitiveness improving or declining? And are they strengths or weaknesses today? And sort of an interesting finding, most people told us that transportation historically has been a strength of Florida because of our road network, our rail system, our ports, our airports, the spaceport. But there was a lot of concern about, will that strength continue as we see more growth in demand, as we see more congestion, as we see different shifts in demand over time? Same for water. Again, historically a strength for Florida, but a lot of concern about, do we have the right water in the right places? And are there some parts of the state where we're seeing increasing coastal flooding or inundation where perhaps we're seeing too much water? How do we deal with that as well? And so in the past, when we thought about growth in Florida, we thought about things like, do we have available land? Do we have our basic highway system and our rail network? And how do we get access to our ports? How do we have our basic utilities in place? All of that's important, but in 2030, we're looking for a different set of infrastructure. And so it's thinking about, where do we have well-planned quality places, whether it's urban or suburban or rural across the state. It's thinking about not just having our great ports and airports, but how do they all connect together? So how do we link our airports, our seaports, our spaceports, our rail and highway corridors together into a network that gets goods to market at that speed of opportunity? It's thinking about public transportation not as something just for the people who are unable to afford or can't drive a car, but as an option for the entire state, and having that range of mobility services, whether it's public or private, shared mobility, the bike shares, the scooters. How do we embrace that range of transportation options in the future? How do we think about Internet of Things and high-speed digital connectivity as sort of not a nice to have, but a must have in every part of the state? How do we continue to diversify and improve the reliability of all of our energy and water systems? So a big task as we look to the future. And as you look at the book, there's many strategies in there, but they generally kind of fall into 4 buckets. And it's really looking at, how do we really envision and plan together what we want to look like as communities and regions in the year 2030? How do we get a vision like a Babcock Ranch or a Lake Nona or other parts of the state that have done that long-term thinking about what we want to look like in 2030 and how do we harness our resources to get there? How do we innovate in everything that we're doing, whether it's transportation or water or energy, to improve efficiency, to improve reliability, to improve customer service? Where do we need to invest strategically to have the infrastructure of the 21st century? And how do we partner, particularly as we think about different roles of the public and the private sectors in funding these improvements for the future? The book has a lot of detail in it. We're going to hear a lot about that from the speakers and the panels who are coming up. And then Tony Carvajal is also going to be leading a discussion among all of us about what are your ideas for moving forward into implementation. So I'd be happy to take some questions on the research as part of that discussion. But let me just sort of leave you with sort of a sense of optimism for the future. You know, Florida's history has been so closely tied to making good decisions about growth and to investing in our infrastructure, whether it was the initial harbors that drew people here, whether it was the rail lines, the Flagler line, the plant line as they were developed, whether it was our initial turnpike and interstate system. Just down here in Southwest Florida, we can think about what's the role that I-75 and Southwest Florida International Airport played in truly transforming this part of the state. So let's dream ahead for 2030. Where do we want to invest in growth? Where do we want to invest in infrastructure? How do we set up our infrastructure to help us live and work and connect at the speed of opportunity? That's what we want to talk with you about the rest of today. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the discussion.